Alright, so let's look at the Golden Ratio and Vitruvian Man and Leonardo da Vinci. Now, at that time, for instance, the Four Corners in Sicily is one of the earliest rebirths of classical architecture, where you have the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian column being an example of that format, the rebirth, the Renaissance, but especially the Golden Ratio, or the Divine Proportion, 1.618033988. You see it in shells, you see it in pine cones, you see it in so many things. It's essential in nature, whether it's from the micro, which is smaller than man, to the macro, which is larger than man. So shells, sunflowers, all sorts of plants, storms, and even galaxies follow this law. Now, whether they knew, I'm not saying they knew the shape of galaxies, but that's irrelevant. What they understood was the value and the omnipresence of the Golden Ratio, and how it appears in all formats, from the micro to the macro. It is a fundamental law, one of the constants of nature. Now, this will all connect to the pyramids. Now, for instance, Vitruvian Man, that illustration by Da Vinci, is based on the work of Marco Vitruvius, and also relates to Protagoras, philosopher, but famous quote, "Man is a measure of all things." Book 3 of 10 books of architecture by Vitruvius. The design of a temple depends on symmetry, the principles of which must be carefully observed by the architect. They are due in proportion, in Greek. Proportion is a correspondence among the measures of the members of an entire work, and of the whole to a certain part selected as standard. From this result the principles of symmetry. Without symmetry and proportion, there can be no principles in the design of any temple. That is, if there is no precise relation between its members, as in the case of those of a well-shaped man. Man is a measure of all things. Temples are based upon the proportions of nature, proportions of man, the temple of man. For the human body is so designed by nature that the face, from the chin to the top of the forehead, or a tala as used in Borobudur and other sites, and the lowest roots of the hair, so the chin to the lowest roots of the hair is a standard measure, for instance, used in the ancient Buddhist temple, Borobudur in Indonesia. Not strictly ancient, but quite old, over 1,000 years old. And, well, the proportions of man, and how from man the measures are derived. Not just the measures, also the proportions, because the body parts are in a certain proportion, and from those proportions we also develop measurement systems, which are so important in the design of ancient temples. Similarly, in the members of a temple there ought to be the greatest harmony in the symmetrical relations of the different parts to the greater general magnitude of the whole. So the small should be in a certain relationship to the large, following this principle, as above, so below, in many ways. Then again, in the human body, the central point is naturally the navel. For if a man is to be placed flat on his back, okay, so what he's describing here is where Da Vinci's famous illustration of Vitruvius Man comes from. For if a man is placed on his back with his hands and feet extended, and a pair of compasses centered at his navel, then the fingers and toes of his two hands and feet will touch the circumference of a circle described therefrom, the circle touching the circle, the hands and the feet. And just as the body yields a circular outline, so too a square figure may be found from it, a square figure. For if we measure the distance from the soles of the feet to the top of the head, then apply that measure to the outstretched arms, the breadth will be found to be the same as the height, as in the case of plane surfaces which are perfectly square. That's Vitruvian Man. That's where this illustration comes from. It's a describe of biology, but of perfect proportions and of temple design. And, well, what was happening at the time of Da Vinci, the classical cathedrals, places such as the Vatican, and the architecture and the sculpture and all the art connected to that from the Renaissance, from the rebirth of ancient knowledge. That's why the music, the art, the architecture is so beautiful. It's a rebirth of ancient systems. And So a pair of compasses centered at his navel. So the navel, or the omphalos. Now, skepsis is the ancient term for navel gazing, which was an ancient aid to meditation. Now we say navel gazing is like someone who's wasting his time looking away at things. Well, that's the modern variation definition of it. But originally, navel gazing was meditation, contemplation, but also a nice link to perfect mathematical, biological proportions, temple design. Now, other references to the omphalos of a navel. Now, Zeus was one of the children of Saturn, Kronos, the Titans. The Olympian gods, Zeus, overthrew the Titans. Zeus had eaten all his children except for Zeus. Rhea, to save Zeus from being eaten, she fed a stone to Kronos, wrapped it in baby's swaddling clothes, and said, "That's Zeus." He ate that, thinking he would eat the last of his children. He feared his children because there was a prophecy that Zeus and the Olympians would overthrow him. When he ate the stone, the Omphalos stone, he then vomited out the children that he already eaten, and then the Olympians overthrew the Titans, and the Olympian gods took over. Now, there's an Omphalos stone, and there are some suggestions that mind-altering chemicals were put inside there, and then you would sniff from it, and because, for instance, the Oracle of Delphi. But the Omphalos at Delphi, this stone here, is the navel and was said to be the center of the world. Zeus, to find the center of the world, sent two eagles out in opposite directions so that they would fly and come back, and when they met, that would be the center of the earth, and that was Delphi. And there we see a reference to this double-headed eagle. That's a Hittite. That's 1800 BC, this particular thing. But the importance of a double-headed eagle through to now. We see it in national flags and emblems, very important, such in Freemasonry. The Hermeticists, alchemists use this symbol as well. But that's navel gazing. But the navel is an important part as well. So the pair of compasses centered at the navel. How does this compare to ancient temples, such as the pyramids or the Parthenon? Duly proportioned fundamental ideas of the measures, perfect proportions and measure systems built off this. The temple of man, the proportions of man, measures based on man. Now, it's also worth noting, so therefore, since nature has designed the human body so that its members are duly proportioned to the frame as a whole, it appears that the ancients had good reason for their rule, that in perfect buildings the different members must be in exact symmetrical relations to the whole general scheme. Hence, while transmitting to us for proper arrangements for buildings of all kinds, they were particularly careful to do so in the temples of gods, building in which merits and faults usually last forever. The pyramids and the Parthenon, these stone buildings, which, most of our buildings are not of stone, but the ones that remain, that's why we sort of identify these buildings, because they were built to last forever. And everything that you do right and everything you do wrong will be reflected in them. And that's why they spent such detail and went to such efforts to make perfect buildings. That practice is still going on. For instance, in the great cathedrals now, the major public buildings such as the US Capitol building, the Supreme Court building in the US, but whether it's any major public building, they go to a lot of effort to get that's why we've done countless videos going across countless cities, ancient and modern, how they use the same set of numbers which are so connected to cultures across the world, across time, across continents. But when he says, it appears that the ancients had good reason for their rule. Well, Vitruvian, who wrote this, lived in the BC, 1st century BC. So who was he talking about when he said the ancients? Now, for him, ancient Rome was current. That was not ancient. The Greeks were relatively modern history. Places like Egypt were ancient, and through places such as the Library of Alexandria, the Ptolemaics were learning, writing down Egyptian history, Egyptian sciences, and then passing them on ancient streams of knowledge. Let's not forget about the people of the Tigris and Euphrates, and also ancient India. Romans were doing massive amounts of trade with ancient India, and where you trade goods, you trade knowledge. So this is where he was, the ancients. This guy lived 2,000 years ago. When he says ancient, he's talking ancient. but also the fundamental ideas of the measures which are obviously necessary in all works, as in the finger, the palm, the foot, and the cubit. Well, what were the Egyptian? What was the unit of measure? They had the cubit, which was from the tip of your elbow to the tip of your finger was 1 cubit. That was then divided into 7 palms, 1 palm being equal to 4 fingers, 7 palms. So 7 palms is 1 cubit, 4 fingers is 1 palm, therefore 28 fingers is also a cubit, proportions of the different body parts. And the Greeks were their measuring systems as well, which brings us back to the golden ratio, or Phi, 1.618033398. But the most beautiful perfect number, and here's an example, Phi squared equals Phi plus 1, 2.618. 1 divided by Phi equals 1 minus Phi, 0.61803. So Phi plus 1 is Phi squared, Phi minus 1 is 1 divided by Phi. Only happens in this number, and this is the number which defines so much of nature, from the macro to the micro. And how does this apply? Well, Phi, Phidias was a Greek. He was the architect designer of the Parthenon, a sculptor as well, and the golden proportion, golden ratio, divine proportion, divine ratio is so often connected to him, and it was rebirthed. The Renaissance made it very much important, which was also what's important about Da Vinci and Renaissance. That coincided with the printing press, where you had not just knowledge exploded because it was able to be replicated, and the books to transmitted, and the growth of libraries in all cities, rather than, as in the ancient times, Library of Alexandria, a little library here, large libraries at a few certain places, but not in every city. So 1.618. Now, the ideal proportions of a pyramid are 440 Egyptian royal cubits by 280, which gives that slope angle of 1.61859, which is very, very close. However, that's idealized. What you actually have is each side of a pyramid has a slight variation, and for instance, on the eastern face, we see 1.618. As well. Now, okay, that should have. There's actually another card where you get even closer to the golden ratio, if you conclude that I've used it. But what we have, even at the very least, we have a very, very close approximate of the golden number. A slight variation, like literally shifting a centimeter or two either way, would affect that, because by the 4th decimal point, so the golden number. Now the Meidum pyramid, or the capstone at the red pyramid, have the same 7 to 11 proportions, 11 to 7, 20. And so it's there we see it in Egypt and other places in Egypt as well. I shouldn't, but just doing it quickly now. One of the pentagon of a pentagram is the perfect representation of the golden number. To do it as a number is essentially impossible, but as a proportion from the pentagram or the pentagon, we get the perfect Phi proportions. And for instance, Phi to 1. Now, when you're born, your omphalos, or your navel, that's at a ratio of 1 to 1 from your height. However, as we grow, the omphalos grows into 1 to Phi. That's 1 to Phi, just like the pentagram. So the pyramid, now it's also worth noting the square, and the edge length of a square and the radius of a circle is at an 8 to 5 ratio, which is a Fibonacci ratio, the Fibonacci spiral. That's the golden number. If you keep the further and further you extend this Fibonacci spiral, the closer and closer you get to perfect Phi. You never quite get there, but onto infinity, you just keep getting closer and closer and closer. And how does that link? Well, with the golden ratio referenced in the Great Pyramid, but the Menkaure Pyramid, the smallest of the three at Giza, is 200 Egyptian royal cubits wide and 125 Egyptian royal cubits high, which is an 8 to 5 ratio, or 1.6 to 1. So the golden number, the divine proportion, now you have to think more of Phi really as a wave, not as a strict, now you can do it to infinite decimal points, but as a geometric construction, we see it all in all the ancient architecture and the references to it. So without maths, there is no art. naology, the study of sacred buildings, and it's also the study of nature, math, and geometry since ancient times. So Da Vinci, Vitruvian Man, golden number, ancient temples,